The House passed a Democrat-backed election reform bill. But is it about voter integrity, or is there another agenda? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. If you like the show, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us with YouTube's crazy algorithms. And if you're already a subscriber, make sure you're still subscribed, because YouTube has secretly unsubscribed people in the past. So, the U.S. House of Representatives has passed a sweeping voter rights and elections reform bill. It's called H.R. 1, the For the People Act. It was written by Democrats, and like so many things these days, it passed almost purely along partisan lines. Every House Republican voted against it, plus one Democrat, Congressman Benny Thompson. He says he voted against it because his constituents opposed the redistricting portion of the bill and the section on public finances. The For the People Act aims to make elections, wait for it, for the people. A similar bill was introduced in Congress in 2019, but it didn't pass because no Republicans voted for that one either. This new For the People bill would introduce big changes to voting procedure nationwide. It expands access to the ballot box with automatic voter registration, early voting, and mail-in votes, things that were key to the Democratic strategy in the 2020 election. One part of the bill replaces state voter ID laws with a federal rule that allows voters to give a sworn statement of voting qualification instead of showing ID. It also contains a measure to create a national system for automatic voter registration, and one that would add transparency requirements for political advertising. On top of that, it changes how congressional districts get drawn. It puts those decisions in the hands of a separate committee instead of elected officials. But all this is just a fraction of what's actually in the bill. Guess how many pages are in it? 800. That's even larger than the 600-page COVID relief package. If you thought being forced to read 600 pages out loud is tough, wait until you get to 800. The bill will be handed over to the Senate on March 24th, but Senate Democrats openly admit that they do not see a path to getting the 10 Republican votes needed to avoid a filibuster, which would block the bill. In fact, some Democrats are counting on Republicans blocking it. I'll get to that later. But so what makes this bill so special? According to Representative Mondaire Jones, this bill fights against modern-day Jim Crow laws.
This is of foundational importance. We are, as you just described, experiencing in many parts of this country a new Jim Crow, where the modern-day Republican Party has as its project not competing on the merits of its policy ideas, but the disenfranchisement of large swaths of the American electorate, like Black and Hispanic voters in southern states like Georgia and in Arizona. And so the For the People Act is common sense elections reform aimed at preventing the right to vote from being suppressed.
The Brennan Center for Justice, a liberal policy institute, also supports H.R. 1. They say the move towards automatic voter registration is good since it will add tens of millions of voters to the rolls, cost less, and bolster security and accuracy. They also support the bill's same-day and online registration to eliminate paperwork and waiting periods. The Brennan Center also says the bill will deter voter purges. They claim voter purges were a key form of voter suppression by election officials in 2018. In short, they say the For the People Act needs to do all it can to protect minorities from being targeted by suppression. Even voter ID laws and cutting back on early voting can be a form of voter suppression. Why? Because voter ID requirements target minority citizens. Now, obviously, there's nothing wrong with having to show your ID to get on a plane or to buy a gun. Hopefully not at the same time. So why does having to show an ID to vote hurt minorities? According to the ACLU, it's because nationally, up to 25% of African American citizens of voting age lack government-issued photo ID, compared to only 8% of whites. To get an ID, it can cost up to $175. For many people, that's a lot of money. Now, if the federal government wanted to pay for free IDs for all 21 million Americans who don't have them, it would only cost a couple $billion. That may sound big, but it would have only been a tiny line item in the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill that just passed. And that thing was 600 pages, so no one would have even noticed. But instead of helping people get IDs, the For the People Act would let people vote without showing ID. In fact, it would do more than that. The act essentially replaces the voter ID laws that some states already have with an option for voters to simply sign a written statement that they are who they say they are and that they're eligible to vote. And that's the biggest concern that opponents of the For the People Act have. No, not the voter ID part per se. The part where this federal bill would completely override state voting laws in many, many respects. And I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. As I mentioned, every congressional Republican is opposed to H.R. 1, the For the People Act that just passed in the House. The biggest issue is not any single provision, but that as a federal law, it overrides many of the states' constitutional rights to govern their own elections. Here's what a former Federal Election Commission member said a couple weeks ago.
Because I don't care whether you're a Republican state legislator or a Democratic state legislator, you ought to be angry at the idea that Washington is going to usurp your role and tell you how to run elections in your state.
Here's what former Vice President Mike Pence wrote in an op-ed last week. H.R. 1 mandates the most questionable and abuse-prone election rules nationwide, while banning common-sense measures to detect, deter, and prosecute election fraud. Republicans argue the For the People Act is just a power grab by Democrats that allows ballot harvesting, election fraud, and voting by felons. Specifically, they fear it would not only open the door for direct election fraud through expanded mail-in ballots and removing voter ID requirements, but would also add more registered voters. Specifically, it would make it easier for convicted felons and illegal immigrants to vote. And the presumption is that they'd mostly vote for Democrats. The Conservative National Review calls the For the People Act an authoritarian outrage. And they say Democrats want to corrode the system because they believe it will help them win. There's another issue with the 800-page For the People Act. It's not just about loosening restrictions on who can vote. It's about tightening restrictions on political speech. As Reason magazine, which is libertarian, says, the legislation tackles a host of questions involving campaign finance, political speech, and online speech, and its effects would all but silence citizens' abilities to speak about and criticize politicians and their policies. For example, the bill requires lengthy disclosures on any paid online political ad, or even meme. And these disclosures would have to include the sponsor's name and give a means for the viewer to find the sponsor's street address, telephone number, and website URL. Look, if the Russian government is behind a political ad, you'd probably say, yeah, we have a right to know. And that's actually the context the bill gives for the new rules. But the way the bill is written, it also affects individual American citizens. Let's say you're part of a minority group that's being suppressed. If you pay for an online political ad, your name and address would be exposed to the public. And what if you have an unpopular point of view? The Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, says this will expose millions of Americans to the radical left's cancel culture crusade. On the other side of the spectrum, it could also expose minorities to intimidation by white supremacists. But the main thing it will do is just make Americans less willing to voice their political ideas. And that just helps the people who are already in power. Funny the people in power would write that into the bill. Here's the former FEC member I mentioned earlier again.
This is one of the worst bills I've ever seen in my years in Washington.
But good news for people who oppose the bill. The Senate Republicans are probably going to block it with the filibuster. But is that part of Democrats' plan all along? I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. Some Democrats may be hoping their For the People bill actually gets blocked by a Senate filibuster. Sure, that would kill this particular bill, but then Democrats can use it to argue that the filibuster system itself needs to be killed. And that would then give Democrats the ability to pass anything they want. Here's how the filibuster works. To pass a bill in the Senate, it needs at least 51 votes. And Democrats have 51 votes, including Vice President Harris. But before a vote can happen, senators first need to agree that they're done debating the bill. So senators who don't want a bill to come to a vote can filibuster, which means to continue the debate endlessly. To stop a filibuster, that requires 60 votes. So the filibuster ends up protecting the minority party, and it forces a certain measure of bipartisanship in the Senate. Senators used to actually filibuster, as in make speech after speech all day and night to continue the debate, like the lost causes scene in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But nowadays, they don't have to do that. Everyone just knows that you can't get a bill passed without 60 votes. So if they don't have that, the bill is essentially done. In 2021, the minority party is the Republicans. And that's why Democrats want to get rid of the filibuster. It's the only way to pass some of their agenda items. And since Republicans are planning a filibuster to stop the For the People Act, this gives Democrats a reason to argue it's time to eliminate the legislative filibuster so that the Senate can approve bills with a simple majority. And if Democrats succeed at eliminating the filibuster, they'll be able to pass any bill they want, at least for the next 2 years. After that, Republicans could potentially control the House and Senate and pass any bill they want. You can see how this might be a problem in the long term. But that's in the future. The important thing is that killing the filibuster would give Democrats more power now. And that's why more Democrats are joining the effort to kill the filibuster as a way of saving Biden's agenda. The only problem is President Biden. As a former senator, Biden is so far not supporting filibuster reform, which pits him against more activist Democrats. And it's unclear which side will back down first. So what do you think? Do you think the For the People Act is actually for the people or against the people? And should the Senate get rid of the filibuster? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, America Uncovered is supported mainly by viewers. So visit patreon.com/America Uncovered. Contribute $1 or more per episode. We rely on your support to help us keep making great episodes. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.